Welcome to the Our Oakville podcast, where we discuss the importance of belonging in the place that you call home. These conversations are centered around a sense of belonging in the beautiful town of Oakville, Ontario, though the reflections and experiences shared are applicable across the globe.
Oakville, as we know it today, is rich in its history and modern traditions of many First Nations and Métis. We acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as being the rightful stewards and title holders of this land.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the podcast participants. Any content provided is of their opinion and may not reflect the opinions of the town of Oakville.
Our Oakville is for Indigenous history. In this episode, we discuss with the Traditional Knowledge and Land Use Coordinator with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as he brings wisdom and knowledge and an understanding of the land we now call Oakville. Hi everybody and welcome to our Oakville podcast. We are your hosts Nabil Rahman and
Daniel Ridsdale.
Perfect. Now, as you all know, June is many things. And one of the wonderful things that June is National Indigenous History Month. And we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Darin Wybenga and our good friend Julian Kingston from the museum, who are going to enlighten us about a lot of Indigenous history and why June is National Indigenous History Month and the wonderful conversations that we're going to get to. But before we do all of that, Darin, do you want to just do a quick introduction, tell the wonderful listeners about you and just just where we're going to take the conversation today?
Right. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Darin Wybenga. Once again, I'm the Traditional Knowledge and Land Use Coordinator for the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And one of my jobs here is to educate people about the treaty lands and territory of the First Nation, which Oakville is part of. So that's more or less what I do. I do a few other things like some GIS mapping and some research, but one of the things I like doing the most is talking about our history.
And Darin, we very much look forward to learning that history. I think many of us who've been living in Oakville, working in Oakville, or just in the Halton region, I think the masses would really admit that there's so much that we do not know. And knowing is a part of belonging, right? Because especially knowing about the history of the land that existed before any of the settlers came in here, myself included. And I know from that end, we have Julian Kingston from the museum. So Julian, just a quick introduction of yourself and just what are you looking forward to learning from Darin today?
Hi, yeah. So I'm Julian Kingston. I take care of the Oakville Museum, and I'm very excited to meet you, Darin, virtually.
Me too.
Yeah, great. The museum sits very firmly on Treaty 22. I often joke that it couldn't be more Treaty 22 from where it is. And historically, we have not done a great job of acknowledging that, and also the stories, Indigenous histories and the stories that came before Oakville and the Chisholm family and all the stuff that we are or have been pretty good historically of talking about. And actually built right into our new-ish strategic plan are a few points that will hold us to task on that. If we really put it down there in black and white to say that we're going to do a better job of engaging with those stories. And so this is actually kind of one of those steps. So I'm really excited to do this, even though we're doing it virtually. And just happy to have the conversation.
Well, wonderful. I'm glad Oakville is looking toward that. You're not the only area in southern Ontario. Matter of fact, I would probably say Ontario, Canada, that doesn't do much with Indigenous first histories. So I'm glad that people are becoming much more aware. There's been really an impetus in the last year or so, I've noticed anyway, with people wanting to learn more about our First Nation and even land acknowledgements and things of that nature. There's been a really big push toward learning and constructing those things.
Cool, great. I'm so glad that I'm so glad that we've arranged this time for us to be able to talk with you today, Darin. I woke up this morning excited. So for those who have listened to this podcast before, they know Nabil and I, and well, now Julian for a few episodes have been talking about community, and Nabil and I specifically have been moving around in our roles as community development specialists, trying to engage with Oakville residents and really try to increase capacity for residents, increase the exposure of the corporation, and do all of this great work in the community. And one area that we've really been lacking knowledge is our understanding of our Indigenous history. And when I was looking at some of the questions we were prepping to bug you with today, I was kind of excited that I might speak to someone who can actually give me the answers. We've known that it's been important for us to gain this knowledge, but it's really been difficult to find those people in the community who have the answers. So I'm so glad that we get to share this experience and this conversation with community. So let's jump right into it, okay?
Okay, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, so let's start with treaties. So
Right.
Halton region, I guess specifically Oakville. Can you tell us a little bit about the treaties that are currently covered in Oakville, and if you'd like to, maybe broader in the Halton area?
Right. So I'm looking at a giant map on my wall right now of the treaty areas. And of course, I see right at the mouth of 12 Mile Creek. I guess you guys call it Bronte down there.
Yep.
That's our Treaty 22 lands. It's also at the mouth of 16 Mile Creek. And those were treaties signed in 1820, one of our last treaties, actually our second to last treaty. Treaty 23 was signed the same day, actually, for parts of the Credit River area. But Treaty 22 in relation to Bronte and 16 Mile Creek, they were small pieces of land right at the river flats, and they were reserved for our people for fishing. That was primarily the reason for them. Our people would camp on the flats of those creeks and partake of the fishery as it happened in the spring and in the fall. So that's right at the mouth of the creeks. A little outside of those treaty areas is a larger treaty area known as our Head of the Lake Treaty, and that's a treaty covers a span of land from the Etobicoke River in the east all the way to Burlington in the west, and it's 6 miles back approximately. We're talking 1806 here, about 6 miles back from the mouth of the lake. I don't know what that adds up to now because, of course, the lakefront moves from time to time as people have added on to it and things like that. So that's a much larger span of land that takes up part of the Oakville area, encompasses part of Burlington and Mississauga. So that's another treaty around the Oakville area. And farther beyond that 6 mile limit, farther beyond the head of beyond the Head of the Lake Treaty is what we call the Adjutants Treaty. And that also encompasses Halton region. And that's a very, very large expanse of land, all the way up to Oakville, of all places. So that was completed in 1818. And still two more treaties for the Halton region. One, the Brant Tract Treaty for Burlington. That occurred in 1797. And that was for a small tract of land where the hospital is in Burlington today. And that was set aside for the use of Chief Joseph Brant of the Mohawk people. And our last treaty encompassing the Burlington region, or encompassing part of the Burlington region, is our Between the Lakes Treaty. And that's a very, very large treaty. It covers something like 3 million acres of land. So you can appreciate the vast size of that, all the way from the Niagara River, all as far north as Centre Wellington County and Wellesley County and Mapleton area. So very large expanse of land. So really the Halton region in particular has 5 treaties with the Mississaugas, the Credit First Nation.
So I had looked at the same map as well. So for those listening who are interested, so, and you can correct me, sir, if I'm, so Oakville, we see Treaty 22, 23, and Treaty number 14, known as the Head of the Lake Purchase. So there are three treaties impacting Oakville municipality. Halton Hills and Milton, yeah, I think you referred to that. Is it the adjutants?
Adjutants, named after one of our chiefs, Chief Adjutants. He's the one that signed the treaty, so he gets the honor or dishonor, depending on how you look at it, of signing that agreement.
So adjutants treaty would be for Milton and Halton Hills, and then looking at Burlington, we have Branch Tract Treaty number 8, adjutants number 19, Between the Lakes number 3 in the Aldershot community, and then the Head of the Lake Purchase, which you had mentioned, which carries into Oakville, Burlington, and Mississauga. So that's interesting for us to know. Nabil, I'll turn it over to you to ask Darin a few more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as I'm hearing you, Darin, I'm trying to process this information about treaties, and oftentimes I'm curious as to the development of these treaties. Right? You said the honor or the dishonor, and kind of got me thinking about the power in developing these treaties. Like the Crown at the time, like were these treaties developed in good faith by the Crown, and sort of what were the pressures on the communities, on the Mississaugas to develop these treaties, and how were they followed through with? Were they honored by the settlers and the Crown, and how did the Indigenous communities receive them, and in particular the Mississaugas? So if you could even just speak to sort of the development of them, what that meant for the Mississaugas, and how were they treated by the Crown?
Boy, you're asking for a lot. I guess I'm going to start.
I was about to say, Darin, that's a tough question.
Yeah, we like to hit home runs here.
Well, that's good. No, our very first treaty with the Crown, actually, for those of you interested, was what we call the Mississauga Treaty at Niagara in 1781. And that dealt with a strip of land along the Niagara River. And that was our very first treaty with the Crown. And it was entered to in good faith. The land we're speaking of is a parcel of land 4 miles deep on the west bank of the Niagara River. And the governor at the time who negotiated the deal, a man by the name of Sir Guy Johnson, he supplied us with a number of trade goods for the strip of land, and he supplied us with 300 British coats. And I always love this story because Sir Guy went and talked to his friends and said, I didn't pay much of a price for that land. The 300 coats, I was going to give them to the Mississaugas anyway for staying loyal to us during the American Revolution. So Guy Johnson didn't really think that was part of the price for the land. And let's face it, 300 coats for a parcel of land isn't much anyway. But he thought he was really pulling a fast one on the Mississaugas. But really what it did for our people, it told our people that the British Crown recognized our people as the landholders at the western end of Lake Ontario. So that very first treaty was really not very honest on the Crown's part. But the second treaty we had was that Between the Lakes Treaty, and we mentioned that already, that large expanse of 3 million acres. We signed that we actually negotiated in 1784, but it wasn't ratified till 1792. There was some adjustments to the land because of some mistaken geographic assumptions. But that treaty we entered into so that the Loyalists could take over that parcel of land. And in particular, the Six Nations Loyalists, they had fought for the British during the American Revolution, and they had lost their lands as a result, so they needed a new home as well. So we negotiated Treaty number 3, or like I said, the Between the Lakes Treaty, so that Loyalists could have a home. And we negotiated that in good faith. Matter of fact, we really thought we were going to share the land. And that's how we looked at these early treaties, the Niagara Treaty, the Between the Lakes Treaty, and even the Toronto Purchase Treaty as far as 1805. we kind of went in it with the idea that we were sharing the land, that our people knew that the loyalists were going to come. They would carry on their lifestyle, which was farming or building villages or whatever they were going to do, and we would carry on our traditional lifestyle. We would hunt, we would fish, we would gather, whatever we were going to do as a part of our normal lifestyle. We never anticipated what we got. So pretty soon you have this humongous influx of loyalists. They're coming in, and they're moving into, the Toronto region, and they're moving Toronto, Kingston. They're moving westward, coming into our lands. And all of a sudden, we find plowed fields. We find fences. We find our forests being chopped down. We're finding our fisheries really being taxed with overfishing. So and not to mention, we found we just could not move about the land as we had hoped to. Like I said, we thought we were sharing. The British, when they acquired the land, really thought they were purchasing it, as I say, lock, stock, and barrel. And it's a system that's come down to us today, where I like to call it the sole proprietorship of land. A person buys a lot of land, they own it lock, stock, and barrel. They can do pretty much what they want with it. And that was so foreign to our concept of First Nation land holding. We occupied the land, we moved about it, but we didn't own it. We exercised stewardship over us. I hesitate to use the word ownership, but I suppose if I have to, I would say it was a type of communal ownership in which what's that?
I was just going to say, it was a tough question, but I think you hit it out of the park, Darin. So I'm pretty impressed over here.
Wonderful.
If you don't mind, it's Julian. I'm just going to jump in for a second, because I don't think you have me on video, but you could see me I was wincing over here when you were talking about goodwill on the part of the crown, right? Because I can think of some examples, and it's not always clear. I mean, I always bring my personal opinions to these things, and if I've read some of the dealings between, even between the so-called Indian agent and sometimes it seems like part of the government, was negotiating well and were undermined by other parts. But I'm not going to speak to any of that specifically. But I think one of the things I wanted to kind of jump on was some excellent points that you made. And one of the things that, I have been doing this work in museums for a while. And one of the things that we're getting better at is not telling people stories for them and not retelling those stories without permission, right? So I think this is really important for us to hear it directly from you, right? And I don't want to be putting words in your mouth, but I did want to emphasize something, and maybe you can tell me if I'm on the right track or not, right? Because I think one of the things we really struggle with, especially from a Western, education point of view, is we look at the language that's used around these treaties, and it's languages like purchase and surrender, and, and then we bring all our Western baggage to that and think, oh, well, yes, we just bought it, right? We bought it for a few muskets and 100 coats or whatever, right? Or surrender means that you gave it up, right? And actually, none of those things are true.
Right. I just read those words, purchase and surrender. It's not what we intended, but even our people get caught up when I talk about Toronto, I talk about the Toronto Purchase Treaty.
Right, because that's what we call it in the history, right? But it's not a purchase. It was never intended to be.
And that's what the government calls them, purchases or surrenders or something. And I think as First Nations people, we kind of have to resist that too. I know when I did some of the first editions of our maps, I guess it's supposed to be 6 or 7 years ago, everything was a purchase, surrender. And then our people kind of said, no, it wasn't that way. And so we actually renamed some of our things just simply as treaties. It used to be called the Niagara Purchase. Now we call it the Mississauga Treaty at Niagara. It's no longer the purchase, the Niagara Purchase, or things like that. So we've
I
had
think
to take
that's a really
part of a hand.
important point, because
Language is so important, right? And language is mutable. So if it needs to be changed, then we change it.
Exactly. Matter of fact, I think 22 and 23, treaties 22 and 23, I think they were just called surrenders 22 and 23 when I first encountered them a number of years ago. But at least now there's treaty, there's that implied agreement between the two peoples. At least I like that better. There's just an out and out surrender.
Yeah. I was also wincing a little bit when you were talking about like the honor or dishonor around a treaty. I was thinking about some of the controversy around Peter Jones and his actual right to negotiate some of the stuff that he did or not. There's some interesting stories there.
Well, Peter Jones is always one of those controversial figures, of course, in our history, and even some of our own people don't know what to do with him. I don't know whether they think him as a hero or whether they think of him as a villain. I've always looked toward him as a hero for our people, because after we did all the surrenders of the land, like I said, the last treaty was 1820. We had 4 million acres of land at the western end of Lake Ontario. By the time the last surrender treaty was complete in 1820, we were down to 200 acres of land. We're on the brink of extinction because, remember, we could no longer move about the land as we once did. Our traditional economy collapsed. When you think about it, when we started the treaty-making process, we were up to 500. We were at 500 Mississaugas of the Credit, First Nation people. And then we were down by the last treaty to 200, less than 200 actually. We thought we were on the verge of extinction, but Peter Jones, he found a way to save us, if you want to say that, to force us. I don't know about force us. He helped us to adapt to the way things were. He of course grew up as a Mississauga of the Credit First Nation boy. His name was Waving Feathers. I won't even try and pronounce the Ojibwe. Maybe that's a sign of colonialism.
Let's say if you're going to go there, you're braver than me. But
exactly. I don't learn Ojibwe, though it's making a comeback on our reserve. But he grew up as a First Nations boy and knew everything there was to know about being a First Nations boy, and went and got a settler education because his father actually moved him away from his First Nations people. His father was Augustus Jones, a white surveyor, and he thought the Mississaugas of the Credit people were going to become extinct too. He didn't want his boy to become extinct, so he moved him and his brother away from the reserve, gave him a settler education. Well, Peter eventually grows up and goes to a camp meeting, converts to Christianity of all things, and decides the way to save his people is to convert the rest of his people to Christianity and to teach them how to read, write, and do arithmetic, to put them on a level playing field with the settlers. And so he does that. He succeeds in converting the people to Christianity. We deliberately make an effort to cast off our old ways and our old belief systems, and we take on a system more akin to the settlers. We learn the literacy, we learn about business, we learn about farming, and so we transform ourselves and turn ourselves away from that brink of extinction. And I'm happy to report here in 2021, boy, time flies, we're got about 2,700 band members. So we're definitely not extinct. And I think the path that Peter Jones took us on definitely saved us from extinction. We owe the man a vote of thanks. But there's the other people, First Nations people and other people that see him as really contributing to the erosion of our culture. And in a sense, that did do that. When you adopt a new lifestyle, a new worldview, you lose something, you jettison something. And there was tension within the community way back in 1827 when this occurred. And it occurs now because now, of course, we're trying to recapture some of the culture that we lost.
Daniel here. Thank you, Darin, for the context. I'm hoping I can continue to sort of peel away some of our layers of misunderstanding and building some understanding here. So we sort of spoke about removing terms like purchase and reclaiming some of the language around that. Now, my curiosity is when, as far as the treaties stand, maybe not historically, but now, like what is it that people need to know, or what is it that these treaties are meant to govern presently about those who inhabit this land?
I think for one thing, everybody should know who the treaty holders are for the land that they're living on. Most people don't realize that. When you do a real estate transaction and you go back through time, who owns what? It always starts that the land was parted with, at least that's the way I look at it now. It was acquired from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So that's one thing I always want to start off with. And that's how Southern Ontario gets settled, Oakville, so on, all the rest of the communities in Southern Ontario. The second thing I want people to remember is those treaties are still in force today. They're still valid. And if you were to take the time and read those treaties, they are exactly what I kind of like to characterize as a real estate transaction. They talk about the land, how many miles north and how many miles west and how many miles south, and where the border starts and where it ends, the size of the parcel, and so on. But what people forget, at least in terms of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, it does not give us any rights, and it does not. Those treaties do not take away any of our rights. The treaties are actually quite silent about the rights that we have and that we hold today. The treaties, like I said, never took the right away from us to support ourselves on our lands. They've never taken away our right to govern ourselves. They've never taken away our right to look after our own affairs in general. So that's what I mean. Sometimes the treaties are just real estate transactions. In a sense, they've never, like I said, never taken away our Indigenous rights. And that's another thing that people have to try and deal with and recognize today, is how do we reconcile the rights of the settler folks that have come on the land in the last little while to that of the First Nations people that were here for generations before, a whole lifestyle, a whole system of doing things, and now they're clashing. And so that's what the whole truth and reconciliation movement is about today. How do we reconcile the rights of First Nations and the rights of the settlers? We're both on the land today, and we both should be sharing it. I certainly think of sharing even today with the First Nation, with the settler folks. So like I said, I think those treaties are endearing. We have to do what we can, both sides, to reconcile ourselves to each other's presence on the land, and that's a difficult path. And both sides are still going to have to figure out what that means. Part of it is just this blog today. How can people
we'll
come
actually have to talk about it?
Pardon me?
Darin, we'll actually have to talk about it like we are today.
Exactly. We have to start that conversation. And part of that conversation is just getting to know each other. I taught school for, 20 years. I know a lot about the settlers because one of my jobs was teaching history.
Right.
But how many people get to know the First Nations and actually know who we are? How many people in Oakville, for example, know who occupied the land before them? Sure, we're the Mississaugas of the Credit. Sure, we're the treaty holders. But even before us, there were First Nations on the land. we took over from the Haudenosaunee people, or the Five Nations Confederacy, if you will. Before that, there was the Huron-Wendat people in the Oakville area, and before that, there were. If you go back far enough in time, you have Paleo Indians on the land. So there's a whole vast amount of history and prehistory that has to be learned. But right now, I'm just open for a conversation between the settlers and the treaty holders.
Yeah,
Me too.
and I think that's sort of like, Darin, thank you for that. That's the focus of what this podcast is. We connected also with an Indigenous resident in Oakville to speak to their experience living in Oakville as an Indigenous person, as an urban Indigenous person, and I think what you mentioned there, and it's so relevant that we know of the settlers' experience, and maybe those experiences are shared and promoted in educational spaces and traditionally in museums and things like that. I'll be the first to admit I know very little about the Mississaugas. And I was hoping, Darin, if you could just share with us a little bit about, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, just a little bit about their culture, so those who are listening can get a little bit of an idea of the culture, the history that existed before the settlers came, and then maybe from Julian we'll get this understanding of how can we incorporate that into the curriculums that we have to be able to share that, disseminate that information, and do it in a way that still honors the Mississaugas, still honors the land. So I would love to hear a little bit more from you just about the culture and the history of the Mississaugas.
Right. Our people are actually a subgroup of the Ojibwe people. In our language, we call ourselves the Anishinaabe. It's just a word that means the people. And we arrived actually from northern Ontario. We were first encountered by the French around 1632 up along the Mississauga River in northern Ontario. I believe that's that area just east of Sault Ste. Marie. About 100 kilometers or so, I believe it is. And we came down in about 1685, 1695, a period of time known as the Beaver Wars. We came down and pushed out the Haudenosaunee people that had occupied the area. And so we arrived about 1685, like I said, and we take up our traditional lifestyle on the land. So we're moving about the land. We're very seasonally migrant people. We never last in any one spot on a permanent basis. We always camped at the flats of rivers and creeks flowing into large bodies of water. In northern Ontario, it was Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. Down here, it's Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So we camped. In the spring, we partook of the salmon fishery. We also like to gather together to harvest maple syrup in the spring. And in the spring was a wonderful time of gathering for our people because we used to gather, of all places, at the Credit River. That was our big gathering place. That was our principal home at the Mississauga for the Mississaugas of the Credit, hence the name Mississaugas of the Credit. We'd gather there in the spring. It was a time for ceremony. It was a time to meet up with our families, renew relationships, play games, sports, and that was in the spring. In the summer, we'd move off across the land, split up into different family groups, move about the land. Fall, we'd come back again to the fishery at the Credit River, partake of the fishing, and then once that was over, we'd move out about the land again, partake in the hunting and the trapping time so that we could trade with the fur traders. Matter of fact, I should mention that's how we got our name, the Mississaugas of the Credit. The Credit River, we used to call it the Missinihi, but about early 1700s, the French put up the trading post there, and we used to go to bring in our furs. But sometimes in the off season, we would need a trade good, maybe a pot or a gun or some such thing. And that would be in the off season, and we would go to the trader, could we have that pot? Can we have a gun? We need that, and we will pay you back later on. And the trader would agree and say, yes, you pay us back in the spring when you bring in your catch of furs. They extended us credit. The Mississaugas becomes known as the Credit River, and we become known as the Mississaugas of the Credit. And that traditional lifestyle, we traded with the French, we traded with the British too eventually, lasted until probably, I would say until the time of the American Revolution and the influx of the Loyalists. So, like I said, a very I don't like the term nomadic. It makes people think of Bedouins and deserts and all that kind of stuff. But what did I call it? A seasonally migrant lifestyle is what we had. So that's important to understand too. And we have to be in contrast, of course. I know there's this nasty tendency in Southern Ontario, I think all places actually, to lump all the First Nations in together. But in Oakville particularly, you have the rich history of the Huron-Wendat to look at. You have the rich history of the Haudenosaunee people, both Iroquoian people, so they're different from the Ojibwe or the Anishinaabe people. They lived in long houses. They were farmer people, agricultural type people, I should say. The traditional First Nations crops of corn, beans, and squash. So they're very different people than we at the Mississaugas were, that, like I said, seasonally migrant people. So Oakville has a wonderful amount of First Nations history to indulge in.
Absolutely, and maybe Julian, to you, like I'm putting myself out there that I would not know if you were to ask me that this history that you just shared with me, Darin, this is not something that I was aware of, that I knew, or even I think which is so important, the differentiation between the different First Nations, right? That not just because I might know a little bit about the Mississaugas doesn't mean the Haudenosaunee had the exact same culture, right? And exactly, right? And it's so important because when I look at my own life, people might look at me and designate me as somebody who's South Asian. But even within the South Asian diaspora, there's so many different cultures, languages, religions that make up that. And to know about those diaspora, the differences and the similarities, that's what gives me a sense of belonging and a sense of connection. So I'm just going to pass it over to Julian to speak to how can we, as an institution, promote some of that awareness and that understanding in relation and in connection and in partnership with our First Nation communities.
Well, I think first I just want to thank Darin for sharing all this with us. I mean, I think this is how we get started, right? And I couldn't agree with you more, Darin, is that we start by getting to know each other, right? It's about just building some of that communication, some of that trust, just some of that sort of comfort level. And I think that's kind of one step. And I really like your reference to talking about teaching and education and your experiences as a school teacher, because I think our education system could be a big help, but often it's not. It's kind of the opposite. Like it perpetuates bad information and harmful myths. I mean, there's this whole idea, for example, that when Europeans came here, the forests were empty, right?
Right.
Nobody lived here. They just started, cutting down trees and making farms. There were hewers of wood and drawers of water, and there was, nothing there, right? Which then basically denies the entire existence of your people, right?
Exactly.
Which is ridiculous. Yeah. And then we kind of touched on this as well, as around the idea of the treaties being surrenders, and they're not actual nation-to-nation treaties, which they are, right? And then some of the injustices, right? Like speaking specifically around the treaties that Oakville sits on, and I really like the way that Kim Patres puts this. He's has been the lawyer for the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Is basically, the concept I think works a lot better is the idea of the Mississauga putting those lands in trust with the Crown, right? so that they weren't giving them up. They were saying, hey, we need some help here. Settlers are basically, running ragged everywhere. So give us some help. We'll put this in trust. And then in exchange, you'll do these things for us. You'll provide us education. You'll provide us another place to, there was a, just like you talked about, there was a transfer, right? There was an agreement to an exchange, which then was never honored, right?
There was supposed to be it's supposed to be a reciprocal relationship is what we were hoping for.
And it wasn't held up on the government side, right? They actually just turned around and sold the land, essentially. Again, my personal opinion, I might get into some trouble around this, but that's kind of how I see it.
No, Treaty 22-23, classic example. Those treaties really, I always argue, were negotiated under duress. We were, like I said, at the verge of extinction when those treaties were negotiated. And we're starving, we're ridden with disease, and we think we thought ourselves we were going to be extinct. And the government comes along and says, listen, we can provide clothing for your women and children, we can provide food if you'll part with these parcels of land on 12 and 16 and the Credit River. And so we agreed to that. And the funny thing is, the government at the time agreed to sell those lands on our behalf and apply them to the welfare of our people. And so even today, we have a claim against the Crown to find out what happened to those monies. So that's an ongoing issue, even to this very day. And the treaty making process, well, anybody that is a student of history knows that there's plenty of claims against the Crown, plenty of them. So that's how bad the process was really carried out.
Yeah. And so to kind of answer part of Nabil's question, what can we do? I think we can talk about these things, right? And, just speaking for the museum, well, actually, speaking from my personal opinion about what the museum should do, is, just do a better job of acknowledging that history going forward, right? Like, let's not just make it all about the Chisholm family and the settler history and what happened after 1827, right? But what happened before that? And what were those circumstances? And then I also we need to bring it up to the present too, right? Because another myth is that there are no Indigenous people anymore, right? We don't have any that live in Oakville, and that's not true either, right? So we have to bring it right up to the present and say okay, we have this history, but we also have this lived experience that we're all living now, right? And my standard joke around the museum is to my kids, the 90s is history, right? So that's all fair game. We can bring it right up to the present, and we need to around these conversations, particularly when we're talking about truth and reconciliation. We have to talk about now. We can't just talk about that.
Right. Talking about museums, I'd love to go into a museum and see an exhibit about our people. Often I see First Nations exhibits, but I don't see anything peculiar, or I should say particular, about the Mississaugas of the Credit. And that bothers me sometimes because I can't see myself or our people in a museum. And so I'd love one day for museums to take that on and do something specific for the treaty holders in the regions. And maybe that's something part of that reconciliation process, and right up to modern times too.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think we should be working with, it's the kind of thing where, museums shouldn't do it for somebody. They should do it with somebody, right? Because it's not our voice, right? Or it shouldn't be just our voice. It should be us facilitating and us amplifying, not us telling.
Right. Anytime you can get First Nation voices heard, I think is a wonderful thing. And I think that includes exhibits, even schools, if you go, even inviting Indigenous people to schools to talk. I think it's funny, after teaching all those years, I was the only Indigenous teacher they had, or a person that gave an Indigenous perspective on history, I think of so many people in Toronto, throughout the whole treaty lands and territory actually, that go through school, high school, grade school, and never hear an Indigenous voice or not even travel to a First Nations reserve. I think that's tragic. I wish that would happen.
Yeah.
So I know you haven't been able to listen to our previous podcast episodes, Darin. Sorry, it's Daniel speaking to you. But what we've tried to do each conversation is really lay out a case for why belonging is important and the work that has to be done by each individual resident to ensure that everyone has a chance to belong. And I know, so this is one of two conversations we've been having regarding our Indigenous community here in Halton, or more importantly, Oakville. And I think it's, even from these short conversations, I think, and I hope that people are taking away why it's so important to really go deeper and continue to try and learn and develop an understanding about other groups in order to ensure that they're capable of experiencing that belonging. Because it's not that simple. And I think particularly for our small Indigenous community, it is not simple to form a level of understanding that can increase one's belonging. Because we don't have the tools built into our social systems of how to learn about those people. We just spoke about our public school system and education. I don't think that those tools are really there. That for those listening, I think obviously listening and seeking out the time to build your understanding of Indigenous history is important, but there is a lot of individual work that has to be done to ensure that belonging is achieved for our Indigenous brothers and sisters who share the land with us. We've been so fortunate to be able to have a conversation with you and others in the community about this issue, but the reality is that this information is not easily accessible. I've been working for the town of Oakville for over 4 years, and I'm even finding now that my understanding of Indigenous communities is just starting to scratch the surface of what's available. Even today, learning some of just the pattern of history and transfer of land between the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee and Mississaugas of the Credit is so important that I hope folks listening sort of take it upon themselves to put in some of the work that is needed. The other layer of that is that I think that folks who are seeking that level of belonging, the stakes are so high. When you understand that the history of your people is entrenched with, misdeeds around purchasing or taking of land, even within your lifespan now, or within your own life experience, being not necessarily you, but those in our community of residential schools. The case and importance of belonging after experiencing such trauma and harm can't be greater. So I really do appreciate your time giving us some understanding, and I hope that those listening really do begin to appreciate and try to reform their understanding of Indigenous communities here in Halton, and take some individual accountability for understanding why that belonging is important and what you can do to create a better community for everyone. Nabil, I'll throw it over to you. I know that we have so many questions for Darin. We do want to hold it to a reasonable amount of time of his afternoon today. But Darin, sincerely thank you for sharing with us. Nabil, I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, no, Darin, I think we echo that sentiment, or I echo that sentiment for sure. It was immensely beneficial and knowledgeable. And what I want to do is to give you the final word, Darin, and in terms of what you would like from the residents in Oakville. What would you like from us as a town to just share this knowledge, and to give those voices, like you said? I think when you were speaking, I was literally envisioning in my head, like, this is the quintessential definition of colonization, the expropriation of resources to a people on the brink of extinction, and then offering a helping hand as if that hand is like it's exploitation. And how can we not talk about that? How can we as Canadians, because if you don't talk about that, we will never make amends for that. We will never try to know more about that. And I can't come here as an immigrant living in this land and celebrating all that it has to offer without acknowledging some of those things. So for me, and just to you as the final word, Darin, what is it that you would like to see from the residents and institutions here so that we share those voices and we try to work towards truth and reconciliation?
Right. That's always a tough question too. I suppose I would like people to remember that we are still here. The treaty holders are still here. First Nations people are still here. I would like people to honor the spirit of the treaties, their enduring agreements. Pardon me. We still expect to share the land today. We still expect justice today. I know there's been a terrible history, but now, okay, we can't go back and relive those times. But what we can do is talk about justice today, try and reconcile ourselves to each other, treat each other with respect, peace, and friendship, and move toward a new future together. There's something called the two-row wampum. It's not a wampum belt original to the Anishinaabe people. It's a belt that has originated with the Haudenosaunee people and the settlers in the United States. But basically, it's two rows of white wampum, or two rows of wampum on white wampum on a belt, and they signify two groups of people, the First Nations and the settlers, and they're running in parallel to each other down a river. There's a settler boat, and there's think about it as a First Nations canoe. The two are running parallel to each other down the river, never to intersect, to interfere in each other's affairs. Well, that's kind of an aspirational thing. Let's treat each other with the respect, the friendship, and the peace as envisioned in that wampum belt, and let's move toward that spirit of reconciliation insofar as we can.
Absolutely. Well said, Darin. Julian, if there's anything else you would like to add to that, I just want to give you also the opportunity. If there's anything you would want to add to that.
No, I'm just really grateful to be part of the conversation. Really pleased to have met you, Darin, and hopefully we can have more conversations.
Wonderful. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Julian, Darin, Nabil, and for everyone listening, thank you for joining us in this time. We hope that you check out some of the other recordings of the Our Oakville podcast, and we certainly hope that you take some of the learnings about the importance of belonging, specifically those for our Indigenous brothers and sisters who share the land with us. Hope you all have a wonderful day.
Miigwech.